My name is Kycell, along with my good friend Ahani Rawu and our bodyguard Myrink. I have finally closed in on the story of the forgotten Minotaur King. We stood in shocked silence as the cavern once again shrouded in complete and utter darkness. The image of the hidden skeleton legions dimmed in the chamber, but was burned in our minds. As we stood there, the creaking sound of muscleless joints that hadn't shifted for years began filling the cavern as well. Always the first to gain a hold of her wits, Myrink unholstered both ornate guns, aiming one into the darkness and the other at the Minotaur Kind's skull. He put up one of his three-fingered, hoof-like hands in a gesture of civility, then grabbed a hold of the metallic iconographied door to the chamber and closed it tightly. With the other target obscured now, Myrink used her second gun hand to shield Ahani and myself as she edged back to the entrance of the cave just outside of Goldenarod. Now with both of his brawny arms raised in a gesture of supplication, Kind followed us back up the sloped floor and out of the cavern. Once we were back in daylight, and Kind had left a substantial space between us, I felt it was as good a time as ever to start asking further questions. I stepped past Myrink and looked Kind directly in the face. Then I asked, what exactly was that he had just presented to us?
A few years ago, I was traveling the world and I met all kinds of interesting folks. One of them was a skeleton man, except he wasn't made out of bone, but more like brittle charcoal, shaved down to look like a fleshless human corpse. He told me of the Vegabane Legion, an ancient fighting force created by some great necromancer that fancied himself a god. Then, up in a bend in the whole lot, hordes of them all over the world. You just need a big enough alcove and the right caster, and you can summon at least a fraction of them to do your will.
The answer he gave was quite straightforward, surprisingly. I now had the what, but I still needed the why. Necromancy is a commonly frowned upon school of magic, at least in societies that believe it disrespects their dead. To call forth so many, Kind must have been truly desperate. There was also the matter of Kind not exactly striking me as the kind who shuts themselves off in tombs and crypts for months on end to study the dead and how to control them, so I also needed the how. However, when looking into his grizzled but sincere-seeming face, I knew many of my questions could be resolved by finding out more on whom I came here for. Finally, getting down to Krunturg and his relationship with the Mindases and the Rajalasad Empire. After the failed assassination plot against the king, and despite his seemingly fortuitous rescue of that king from the man known as Thief, Krunturg was unceremoniously returned to his cell, adjacent to the furnaces, and the farrier, the zebra centaur, Eeyore. He rested his mind and tended to his wounds that night, knowing his only opportunity to slay King Björk Mindas would be after his fight, when the king came to crucify the loser into a golden statue. He prepared for battle the following evening. This was when Kind finally offered a clear and much more detailed description of Krunturg's appearance. Standing at a gargantuan 9 feet tall, larger than the average Minotaur, his frame was nearly as wide as he was considerably tall. His fur was a dark blonde color, with deep reddish hues highlighting certain areas. Many questioned if it was natural, or the blood of fallen foes that had dried and stained his body. His face was very blocky, and adorned with a massive copper oval ring dangling in the space between his nose and mouth. The ring was worn, flaky and cracked, looking to be older than that of an elder Minotaur's, despite his obvious youth and vigor. His horns were a faded brown, sitting directly on his brow and curving upwards at a 60-degree angle, with a span of over 1.5 meters. Yor, the farrier and smith, took it upon himself to craft Krunturg's hammer into an even more deadly tool. The new weapon had a blood-red wooden handle, wrapped with multiple strips of tanned cloth. The handle was twice that of the length of the average crag hammer, and at its head was a sterling bronze cap. The front of the weapon was a massive square, the size of a chair seat, with jagged edges that jutted in a barbed wire and lightning bolt design, looking sharp and deadly, and clearly stained with recent blood. The back had an upwardly curved point, ending in a blunt spike. At Krunturg's request, Yor emblazoned the ancient Minotaur god Kord's seal and strength into the crag hammer as a finishing touch. He found himself escorted through the castle by the very guards whose brothers he had slayed on his previous outing. They brought him through the winding and sprawling keep and into the great hall he had snuck into before. Before him was the spotted white and brown Minotaur from the previous bout, Fam Leeman. Kind, at this opportunity, informed me that even Krunturg found the name rather preposterous, but Fam took the name to heart and honored his family by continuing it. Once again, the bookends of the hall were lined with patient and well-armed guards. Krunturg looked to Fam and saw a fellow Minotaur pushed beyond the breaking point. He harbored no ill will to the man, nor Fam to Krunturg, but they had a duty. Fam to his wife and son, and Krunturg to his pride and honor. The two squared off against each other once, and waited for the crier's call. Krunturg took this time to notice the king's daughters weren't in attendance to this fight. This was beneficial. They wouldn't get in the way, and he didn't wish to cause harm to the young women. He also took note of the several golden Minotaur statues perched beyond the king's podium, likely previous failed fighters. Finally, the crier's voice rang out over the courtyard. This fight that was about to commence would see the champion Fam Leeman versus the king's savior Krunturg. The honorific of King Saver didn't sit well with Krunturg's mind. However, knowing the coming irony of the crier's words did put a smile across his face. Fam Leeman hesitantly went to the weapons rack and removed the sword he had used to defeat the Man Reaper, while Krunturg just hefted the Craghammer in both hands fearsomely. Just before the battle finally commenced, Byrk Mindas once again let out a lofty yet vague threat to Fam regarding his wife and son's safety. With what Krunturg was now concluding was some kind of customary gesture, Fam let out a roaring,
"My family!"
once again, and charged Krunturg sword whipping wildly. Sidestepping such untrained combat form, with a swing of his hammer, Krunturg disarmed the undisciplined Fam. While Fam scuttled to the floor to retrieve his sword, Krunturg attempted to close the distance and offer Fam a proposition. Confused, the smaller Minotaur merely held his sword to his chest in a defensive gesture, only for Krunturg to snag Fam by the collar and shoulder toss the man halfway across the hall, and hopefully out of earshot of the king or any attentive guardsman. With a moment's reprieve, Krunturg knelt down and told Fam his plan to kill the king. Me and Ahani were once again enraptured by how well Kind told this story. I had nearly forgotten all about the skeletons beneath Goldenrod amongst this daring coup Krunturg had planned what must have been a decade past. It wasn't until Tristafé gave us a loud and declarative throat clearing that we were brought back to reality.
This is all fascinating, and I know it is why you dragged me through half of Indignia to hear it, but I would like to know why you have an army of undead, and how are we supposed to trust you?
Fam gave a hearty grunt and started back into town. We followed in curiosity, and Tristafé followed with her hands rarely leaving her holsters. We trekked back through the flowers and back to the main road, when Kind passed the public house and continued to a slightly more affluent-seeming district of the kingdom. Our confusion arose once more. He sidled up to a particularly baroque house and produced a ring of keys from the back pocket of his canvas slacks. Opening the rather spiffy wooden door and flattening down his short mane of hair, he entered, and we followed. The first thing we heard was the pitter-patter of small hooves as a tiny, hornless calf of a Minotaur ran up to Kind and grabbed his leg with a gurgled phrase that sounded close to Dad. Kind gave the little fellow a tussle on the head, and the calf went running off behind a house wall. Ahani let out a sigh of adoration, and even Myrink took her hands off of her holsters and stuck them innocently under her armpits. I just stared at Kind curiously.
That's just my little guy, Court. I want a better world for him. Better than the one I grew up in. Slave to a despicable snake like that King Byrk. Here, I'm just getting to the beginning of Krunturg's reign. Let me just send this hitter home.
Kind went around the same corner his son Court had scampered off to, and pointed for us to take seats on any of the plumply cushioned chairs lining the seating area of the home. We heard some muffled voices in the distance, and a few minutes later we saw a youthful, pockmarked elven girl exiting the house after giving us a courteous bow on the way out.
That sitter of mine is a good kid. Alright. Sorry the wife's away and I wanted to show you exactly what I'm fighting for. Now, where was I?
Kind re-entered the sitting room with Court under his arm. He took a seat in an empty armchair as the calfling rolled around between us, and he continued his story. With another hearty shoulder flip, Krunturg threw Fam, this time near directly at King Byrk Mindas' feet. Feigning a fall, Krunturg knocked over the weapons rack. Picking up a small dagger meant for tossing, he lunged it in the direction of the two spectating humans. A miscalculation resulted in the dagger spearing the crier through the cheek. As he yelped, Fam got to his feet and began charging the king. Byrk shouted for the guards to seize and execute them both. With a serpentine hand gesture, the king locked eyes with Fam, and the Minotaur began to bellow in horrific agony. Not immediately solid gold, Krunturg could see Fam's gait slowing, and a metallic sheen starting at the base of his hooves was creeping slowly up the Minotaur. The guards enclosed around Krunturg. However, given his experience the previous day, he made short work of more than half of them before closing the distance between himself, Fam, and the king. With a wild fury, Krunturg rushed the king and gored him through the left shoulder, nearly separating it from the king's very body. But with his still intact right arm, the king grasped Krunturg's leg and began to rapidly solidify it into gold. Looking back, Krunturg saw that Fam was practically a statue from the waist down already. With a cleave, Krunturg brought the thunderous hammer down upon King Byrk Mindas' skull, pulverizing it into a red slurry. Standing and covered in the king's blood, the Chrysiopian effect on his legs dissipated. He turned to see Fam hadn't been as lucky, as he remained partially petrified to gold, concerned as the halls began to flood with a proper army's worth of guardsmen and much more well-equipped knights. Krunturg noticed a small but incredibly important detail. Wherever droplets of the king's blood landed, gold objects had reverted. The gold tiling on the floor became mere marble where the blood pooled. The lavish golden arms of the throne appeared cheap soft wood where Byrk's brain matter dribbled. With little option, Krunturg hoisted the body of the king and swung it by the legs in the direction of Fam. The viscera that drenched the confused Minotaur dissipated the gold that encased his hooves. Free, he took up a second sword and pivoted to face the encroaching guards. With the corpse still in his hands, Krunturg turned to the many golden Minotaur statues beyond the throne's pedestal, and with a gesture Kind could not stress enough looked utterly ludicrous, Krunturg dashed Byrk against every single frozen Minotaur he could reach, starting with the Man-Reaper. Petrified by the sheer senselessness of what they saw, the knights and guards couldn't bring themselves to react. Before a dozen or more confused and partially battle-drunk Minotaurs stood before them, Fam pointed them to the upturned weapons rack, and Krunturg, with a leaderly roar, led the Minotaurs in an assault Kind was told lasted 3 days, until the remaining human forces of the castle surrendered. So appreciative of their rescue, the Minotaurs claimed the castle and appointed Krunturg their new king. He took the title, feeling he had finally found his people, and believed he could start a good life in Goldenrod.
And that's how he became the Minotaur King. I met him shortly after the siege. I was barely bigger than my little guy Court here.
He bounced the giggling baby calf on his knee as he finished the story.
Of course, it was all nice and prosperous, real peaceful times. All until the Regelisabs came knocking on our door and made our lives a unbearable hell.